My name is Eleanor. I'm a mother, a retired nurse, and the woman my son asked to wait at a bus stop, alone, after his wedding. I sat there for hours in my Navy suit holding the gift I wrapped with love until I realized I hadn't been forgotten. I'd been excluded. If you've ever poured your life into someone who left you behind, stay with me. This is the story of the moment I stopped waiting and started reclaiming what was mine. At 76, I thought I'd grown used to being overlooked. But not like this. Not sitting on a splintered bench at a bus stop that smelled faintly of gasoline and fried food wearing a navy skirt suit I had ironed at dawn. Not with my heels digging into the soft flesh of my ankles and my fingers going cold around a gift box wrapped in silver paper. 6 hours had passed since I sat down. 6. The wedding was over by now. It had to be. Oh. The sky had turned from gold to slate, the streets gone hushed save for the occasional whine of a passing car that never slowed. No familiar faces, no headlights that lingered. Nathan had told me on the phone just 2 days before in that cheerful, clipped voice he uses when trying not to argue. After the reception, "Mom, just wait by the stop near Pine and Elms. We'll swing by. Shouldn't be long." I hadn't questioned it. I'd simply nodded even though he couldn't see me nod, even though something inside my chest had gone tight at the words "after the reception." I'd told myself it was just a matter of planning. The venue was small, the guest list tight, the timing tricky. It was easier not to press, not to be difficult. So I baked a fresh batch of sugar-dusted cookies that morning, packed them in a tin lined with parchment paper. I wrote his new wife a handwritten card. I pressed the ribbon onto the corner of the gift. A memory book I'd spent weeks assembling, and wore my nicest earrings. The kind I only brought out for holidays. And then I waited. I shifted on the wooden slats of the bench legs, aching back stiff. This bench always faced the wrong way. The gas station lights across the street buzzed with a hum I remembered from years ago when Nathan was still in high school and I used to wait here to pick him up from debate club. A teenager zipped past on a scooter, earbuds in, barely glancing my way. Not that I expected him to. I checked my phone again. No signal, battery blinking red. I'd meant to charge it, but between the baking and the ironing and the note writing I'd forgotten. There was a time, many times, when Nathan would have reminded me. "Don't forget your charger, Mom," he'd say with that half smile, half sigh that meant he was pretending to be annoyed but really just didn't want me to be caught unprepared. But those days had drifted, like fog that slowly pulls back until all you see is open space and a question you're too afraid to ask. I remembered when he first told me about the wedding. "It's going to be small," he'd said. "More of a private thing. Rebecca's parents are paying, so you know." "Tight list," he'd added quickly. "You're still part of it, of course. We'll figure something out." And I had wanted to believe that. I always wanted to believe him. Even when his voice hesitated, even when the details felt thin like tissue stretched over something heavy. But now, in the fading light with my lap full of shortbread and silence, I stopped trying to believe. The last city bus hissed by its brakes, shrieking against the cold. It didn't stop. I didn't stand. Just watched the red taillights disappear into the bend and felt something inside me. A door, a switch. Finally flip. I was not forgotten. I was excluded. And that is not the same thing. The wind had turned colder, picking up the hem of my coat. I clutched the tin of cookies not for warmth but to hold on to something. Anything. Behind me, a porch light flicked on in one of the houses. Laughter spilled from a window. A woman's voice, deep familiar to someone not to me. Nathan's words came back dull and echoing. "Just wait at the bus stop." And I had. I waited until the sky turned from charcoal to silver. Until the bakery truck rolled past, and the smell of rising dough filled the street. Until my legs ached from sitting still, and my dignity ached more from knowing it had never been invited. Then I stood, heels in one hand, tin and gift in the other, back straight. I didn't cry. Not then. That would come later. By the time I reached home, the sun had begun nudging through the clouds, brushing the porch railings with gold. The paint was chipped. The stairs still creaked. The scent of lemon polish greeted me faintly at the door. And behind it, the cold oatmeal I'd forgotten on the stove. I set the gift on the hall table. The cookies on the counter. Both looked ridiculous now, like offerings at the wrong altar. I plugged in my phone, watched the screen flicker to life. Messages began rolling in. A few from acquaintances who had seen the wedding photos online. But one froze me still. It was a photo posted by Rebecca's cousin, a girl I'd met only once. Nathan in a slate blue suit, Rebecca glowing in ivory lace, a long table behind them dripping in candles and florals, dozens of beaming faces, and the caption innocent and brutal, just family. I stared. I zoomed in. My eyes hunted for some mistake, some edge where I might have belonged, but there was none. His father's old friends were there, her godparents, her former roommates, even her second cousin from Wisconsin. But not me. Not a single image, not a single seat, not even in the blurry background of a frame. I had not been overlooked. I had been written out. I pressed the phone to my chest not to quiet the ache. It throbbed anyway, but to steady myself. A single caption typed by someone who didn't even think twice had sliced deeper than any deliberate cruelty. And in that moment I felt it. Not rage, not sorrow. Something quieter, heavier, more permanent, the weight of being erased. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay there under the old quilt, the one with faded blues and stitched edges from a church raffle 20 years ago, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the creaks in the floorboards. I thought about silence, how it gathers, how it settles like dust in corners you once believed were clean. Morning came like it always does, quietly without asking permission. I sat at the kitchen table, a mug of tea steeping in front of me untouched. Across the room sat the unopened gift still wrapped in silver, its corners perfectly creased. It looked absurd now sitting on the hall table, like it belonged to a world I no longer had access to. I traced the rim of the mug with my finger and let my mind drift not to the wedding, not yet, but to the years before it, the real years, when being a mother meant being someone's entire compass. I was 28 when Nathan was born, 39 when his father died. A heart attack. Sudden. A phone call at 4:13 in the morning that cracked the walls of our life and never quite let them seal again. Nathan was 11. He didn't understand it at first. That night after the funeral, he crawled into bed beside me and gripped my wrist like it was the last string tethering him to the world. We stayed like that for hours, his breath hot and broken against my arm, his chest rising with each sob that had no words. And in that moment I promised him, silently, deeply, that I would be both things now, mother and father, shield and shelter. So I took more shifts at the clinic, back-to-backs, overnight emergencies. I skipped dinners, skipped sleep, skipped new shoes so he could have braces and violin lessons and school trips to Boston. I didn't think of it as sacrifice back then. Just instinct, just love, like breathing. And for a long time he saw it, appreciated it. He used to bring me wildflowers in crumpled napkins, scribble notes in pencil. "Thank you, Mom. I love you more than pizza." He was silly, sensitive mine. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to change. It started in college. The calls got shorter, less frequent. I'd ask questions. "How are your classes? Are you sleeping?" And he'd answer with a clipped, "Yeah, fine. Everything's good," like the sound of my voice already tired him. He came home that first Thanksgiving and asked me to stay in the kitchen while his girlfriend visited. "You just make things awkward, Mom," he whispered as he brushed past, not unkind, just dismissive. I laughed, pretended not to hear it, pretended my heart didn't thud against my ribs like I'd swallowed a stone. At some point, he started calling this place the old house. He told people I lived upstate even though it was 40 minutes from his office. He stopped bringing me up in conversation unless prompted. Stopped sending photos. Stopped asking how I was. Instead, he asked for things. Help with a deposit, co-signing a lease, covering an insurance gap. I gave, always, even when I didn't have it. I cut back on groceries, canceled a weekend with a friend, postponed dental work. I told myself it was temporary, that he'd bounce back, that it would come full circle. It didn't. When Rebecca came into the picture, things shifted further. She was polite, polished. The kind of woman who always had a polished laugh, a curated life. I remember the first dinner we shared, how she'd corrected my pronunciation of bruschetta across the table gently like she was brushing lint off a sleeve. Nathan had chuckled and added, "Don't mind her, she's still learning." And I had smiled. Still learning. That phrase stayed with me, like I was some long, slow study in how to be less embarrassing. I began shrinking, softening my voice, editing my stories so they wouldn't sound too small town. I bought new blouses, read articles about their city so I'd have something to say. I didn't want to embarrass him. I just wanted to be allowed in the room. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table, the memory of all those quiet humiliations came back like whispers. Not loud, not cruel, just steady, like waves wearing down a cliff. I stared at the gift, the tin of cookies, the ribbon I had tied twice to make sure it held. And then I looked around the room. Really looked. The tablecloth was one Rebecca had picked out for me at a home goods store. It's more modern, she'd said. The dishes were the ones Nathan preferred. White square-edged, simple. The pillows on the couch were the ones that matched his apartment theme because he said mine looked too busy. And the house didn't look like mine anymore. It looked like a stage set for their comfort, their taste, their approval. I sat there, feet curled under the chair, and realized I had given so much for so long I hadn't noticed that somewhere along the way I'd erased myself trying to be included, not wanted, just tolerated. I took a slow breath, the kind that reaches your toes. And somewhere inside me, not loud, not explosive, something began to untangle. It wasn't grief. That had already passed through me in other shapes. It wasn't anger either. It was a new kind of quiet. The kind that doesn't ask to be filled. The kind that prepares for change. The next morning arrived without ceremony, just light slipping between the blinds and the soft ache behind my eyes that told me I'd slept, but not rested. I got up before the kettle even whistled and moved through the house like someone visiting a place that used to feel like home. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I just moved. I went to the sideboard in the hallway where I'd kept all the old folders, financial files, labeled organized, a habit from my nursing days. I never thought I'd open them again. They were there more for structure than for use. Like museum pieces of a life I had tried to build with good intentions and long hours. I pulled one out, Nathan, college. Inside were tuition stubs, bookstore receipts, the deposit slip from when I helped cover a course he said would change his whole trajectory. He dropped that course 2 months later and never mentioned it again. Another envelope, Nathan, car. A cashier's check, $18,000 from 2011. The used Prius, he said, would keep him safe in Los Angeles traffic. It's better than the train mom he'd told me. I'll pay you back in installments. I never saw a single one. Then Nathan and Rebecca, wedding. I had covered the deposit for his suit. Not the whole wedding, just a quiet piece he never told anyone about. That receipt still had a lipstick smudge on the corner from the time I'd grabbed it in the middle of a grocery run and slipped it into my handbag. Line after line, page after page, medical bills, rent support, credit card emergencies, and tucked in the back, a pet grooming receipt. Their dog, Bentley, $129, every 2 weeks drawn from my account because Rebecca had said, it's just until things even out. That had been 18 months ago. I stared at the pile in front of me, not with anger, but with something quieter, a kind of stunned reverence, as if I were looking at a sculpture I had unknowingly carved with my own body, so much, so often, so invisibly, and still not enough to be invited, still not enough to be seen as family. I closed the folder gently and sat with it in my lap. The weight of it, physical and otherwise, settled across my knees. If Nathan called me today and told me he was sick or broke or scared, I knew in my bones I'd still show up. I'd still cook, still comfort, still offer something of myself. But I also knew, for the first time, that I couldn't keep offering myself to someone who treated me like a faucet. Something to be turned on when convenient, turned off when not. The phone buzzed. I reached for it, already guessing the tone. And I was right. "Hey, Mom. Hope you got home okay. Sorry we couldn't come by. Things ran a little late. Let's catch up soon. Love you." No punctuation where it mattered. No apology. No question. Just smooth words wrapped up like a bandage laid on a wound without asking where it hurt. I stared at it for a long while. Not because I didn't know how to respond, but because finally I didn't feel obligated to. I didn't write back. Instead, I stood up, grabbed my purse, and walked to the local branch of my bank. It was a warm Thursday morning, the kind that carried just a hint of spring tucked beneath the leftover chill. I hadn't been inside this bank in nearly a year. The young man at the desk greeted me with the polite distance people reserve for older women, kind, but without expectation. "I'd like to review my outgoing transfers," I said. He blinked. "Recurring transactions." "Yes," I said, "specifically the ones linked to my son and his household." He hesitated just for a moment, then nodded. "We can absolutely pull that up, Mrs. Pierce, Mrs. Pierce." It had been years since anyone called me that. For the longest time, I'd just been Nathan's mom, a title I once wore like a medal. Now it felt like a name borrowed by strangers. He printed the list and led me to a small room with soft lighting and too many chairs. He placed the papers on the table and slid them toward me. 3 pages, single-spaced. I read every line, baby, every transfer, every dollar that had flowed like a quiet river from my account into their lives. Rent, insurance, a tutoring fee for Lucas, a recurring donation to Rebecca's podcast. That one surprised me. I hadn't even known she had one. Then the last line, a $2,000 transfer scheduled for next week. Description: honeymoon gift, family contribution. Discreet. Discreet. That word did something to me, as if I were some secret benefactor in a life I wasn't allowed to attend, as if my love had to come hidden folded into a bank line without a seat at the table. The banker cleared his throat gently. "Would you like to make changes, ma'am?" I folded the pages carefully and looked at him. He couldn't have been more than 25. His collar was slightly crooked, his skin still perfect. Somewhere I imagined there was a mother who had packed him lunches and reminded him to iron that shirt. "Yes," I said. "All of them. Except 2. He raised his eyebrows. "The college fund for my grandson Lucas," I said, "and the donation to the animal shelter on Main Street." He nodded. "And the rest, cancel them. Effective immediately." I signed the documents. My signature had grown shakier over the years, but that day it was enough. Steady. Final. As I slid the pen back across the table, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not grief, not rage. Clarity. I didn't expect calm to feel like this. Not light, not freeing, not triumphant. Just still. The walk home from the bank had been unremarkable, but I noticed things I hadn't in years. The uneven sidewalk near Mrs. Langley's garden, the way the oak tree by the corner pharmacy tilted a little more each year, the old wind chime on my neighbor's porch that hadn't rung since spring, just spinning quietly on its hook. The world felt the same, but I didn't. Inside the house, the air greeted me like it always did. But this time it didn't ask anything of me. I hung my coat with care the same way I'd done for decades, but I wasn't rushing to get dinner on. No grocery list to review. No bills to calculate. No voice in my head whispering, "You should double-check Nathan's car insurance premium." I walked through the hallway, slowly stopping by the mirror, the one that had hung there since 1992. I looked at my reflection. Hair still pinned neatly, lips bare, eyes steady. The only trace of tension was the deep crease between my brows, the one I'd carried since the year I started working double shifts at the hospital. It softened slightly when I exhaled. I moved into the kitchen. The unopened gift still sat on the counter, the cookies next to it wrapped with twine and sentiment. Neither of them had any place to go anymore. I set the kettle on the stove and pulled out the same floral mug I always used when I needed to think. The handle had a chip barely noticeable, but I ran my thumb over it anyway. I had bought it with Nathan on a school field trip when he was 10. He'd begged me to let him spend his souvenir money on something for me. "So you have something happy to drink from," he'd said. That mug had held hundreds of quiet mornings, dozens of worried nights. It had survived moves, storms, birthdays, and heartbreak, just like me. The kettle screamed to life. I poured the water, let the tea steep. Then the phone buzzed. I knew it would. Part of me had been expecting it, not with hope, but with certainty. A message from Nathan. "Mom, the mortgage bounced. Are you okay?" There it was. "Dad, how are you not?" "I saw the wedding photos. I'm sorry. Not even, 'We shouldn't have left you waiting alone.' Just..." The mortgage bounced. "Are you okay?" The words looked like concern if you squinted, but I'd read too many emails like that over the years to be fooled. This wasn't worry for me. It was worry for the system that had quietly kept his life running in the background. I didn't respond. I sipped my tea. Still too hot, but I didn't mind the sting. At least it was real. A second message came 10 minutes later. "If something's wrong, please tell me." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it sounded like a sentence written for someone else. Something you'd send to a colleague when a spreadsheet wouldn't open. The words were all in place. The grammar correct, the tone neutral. But nowhere in those sentences was there space for the fact that I had waited 6 hours at a bus stop in a dress I ironed at dawn. Nowhere in those words was there a seat at the table, a hand on my shoulder, a quiet, "I missed you." I looked around the kitchen. So many things I'd kept for them. The gluten-free flour Rebecca insisted on, even though she never visited long enough to bake. The sugar-free cereal Lucas had outgrown 3 years ago. The extra charger Nathan had once left just in case. All of it. Evidence of how long I'd kept the porch light on, just hoping someone would come home. And now the person who forgot me was asking if something was wrong. I stood slowly and walked to the drawer in the sideboard, pulled out a pen and my old journal, the one with a marbled blue cover and a small tear on the inside flap. I used to write grocery lists in it, notes to myself, fragments of recipes from friends, but that morning I gave it a new purpose. I turned to a fresh page and wrote in even script, "What I want now." The pen paused, hovering just above the page. I wasn't used to asking myself that question. For years, my wants had been filtered through what Nathan needed, what Lucas liked, what Rebecca expected. Then I wrote the first line, "Not to be useful, not to be needed, just to be treated like someone whose heart still beats." I stared at the words, letting them breathe. They didn't feel dramatic. They felt overdue. I had spent years believing that being indispensable would somehow translate into being loved. That if I stayed helpful, I would always be included. That love, if it was big enough, would circle back and wrap me in return. But I had become the crack things fell through. The mix-up, the oversight, missed birthday calls. "Sorry, Mom, we meant to call you earlier. It was just such a busy day. Family emails I was left off of. I thought I CC'd you. Plans made without checking if I was free. We assumed you wouldn't mind staying with Lucas while we were gone. My presence was not expected. It was assumed. My absence wasn't noticed. It was only measured in what stopped working." The phone buzzed again. "Mom, seriously?" This is affecting our credit. What is going on? I didn't need to read it twice. He was frustrated, not because I had cut him off, but because the machine he'd been plugging into for years had stopped humming. And then, without anger, without spite, I wrote, "There's no confusion. Please direct any future inquiries to your own bank accounts. As of yesterday, mine no longer support you." I hit send. The words didn't feel harsh. They felt clean, like something finally scrubbed of the film that had covered it for too long. The phone rang within seconds. I let it ring. I imagined him pacing. I knew that rhythm. The hands in his hair, the size, the calculations. He would be preparing an explanation, a plea. A new version of this isn't what it looks like. But I was no longer a story to be rewritten. I turned the phone off, placed it upside down on the kitchen table, and sat in the chair I'd had reupholstered last winter. The only thing in the room I'd picked out just for myself. It was time to feed myself something that wasn't disappointment. I stood and made toast. Just toast, no butter, no jam. Just a slice of warmth to put something in my stomach that wasn't emptiness. As I chewed slowly, I listened. To the hum of the refrigerator, to the soft tick of the clock above the pantry, to the breeze brushing the side of the house. And nothing else. No expectations, no noise. Just my breath, my body, my choice. And I thought, this is what real silence sounds like. Not absence, not punishment. Just the sound of a woman finally deciding to stop whispering her worth. I didn't expect calm to feel like this. Not light, not freeing, not triumphant. Just still. The walk home from the bank had been unremarkable, but I noticed things I hadn't in years. The uneven sidewalk near Mrs. Langley's garden. The way the oak tree by the corner pharmacy tilted a little more each year. The old wind chime on my neighbor's porch that hadn't rung since spring, just spinning quietly on its hook. The world felt the same, but I didn't. Inside the house, the air greeted me like it always did, but this time it didn't ask anything of me. I hung my coat with care the same way I'd done for decades, but I wasn't rushing to get dinner on. No grocery list to review, no bills to calculate. No voice in my head whispering, "You should double-check Nathan's car insurance premium." I walked through the hallway, slowly stopping by the mirror, the one that had hung there since 1992. I looked at my reflection, hair still pinned neatly, lips bare, eyes steady. The only trace of tension was the deep crease between my brows, the one I'd carried since the year I started working double shifts at the hospital. It softened slightly when I exhaled. I moved into the kitchen. The unopened gift still sat on the counter, the cookies next to it wrapped with twine and sentiment. Neither of them had any place to go anymore. I set the kettle on the stove and pulled out the same floral mug I always used when I needed to think. The handle had a chip, barely noticeable, but I ran my thumb over it anyway. I had bought it with Nathan on a school field trip when he was 10. He'd begged me to let him spend his souvenir money on something for me. "So you have something happy to drink from," he'd said. That mug had held hundreds of quiet mornings, dozens of worried nights. It had survived moves, storms, birthdays, and heartbreak. Just like me. The kettle screamed to life. I poured the water, let the tea steep. Then the phone buzzed. I knew it would. Part of me had been expecting it. Not with hope, but with certainty. A message from Nathan. "Mom, the mortgage bounced. Are you okay?" There it was. Not, "How are you not?" I saw the wedding photos. "I'm sorry." Not even, "We shouldn't have left you waiting alone." Just, "The mortgage bounced. Are you okay?" The words looked like concern if you squinted. But I'd read too many emails like that over the years to be fooled. This wasn't worry for me. It was worry for the system that had quietly kept his life running in the background. I didn't respond. I sipped my tea. Still too hot, but I didn't mind the sting. At least it was real. A second message came 10 minutes later. "If something's wrong, please tell me." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it sounded like a sentence written for someone else. Something you'd send to a colleague when a spreadsheet wouldn't open. The words were all in place. the grammar correct, the tone neutral. But nowhere in those sentences was there space for the fact that I had waited 6 hours at a bus stop in a dress I ironed at dawn. Nowhere in those words was there a seat at the table, a hand on my shoulder, a quiet "I missed you." I looked around the kitchen. So many things I'd kept for them. The gluten-free flour Rebecca insisted on even though she never visited long enough to bake. The sugar-free cereal Lucas had outgrown 3 years ago. The extra charger Nathan had once left just in case. All of it. Evidence of how long I'd kept the porch light on, just hoping someone would come home. And now the person who forgot me was asking if something was wrong. I stood slowly and walked to the drawer in the sideboard. Pulled out a pen and my old journal. The one with a marbled blue cover and a small tear on the inside flap. I used to write grocery lists in it, notes to myself, fragments of recipes from friends. But that morning I gave it a new purpose. I turned to a fresh page and wrote in even script what I want now. The pen paused, hovering just above the page. I wasn't used to asking myself that question. For years, my wants had been filtered through what Nathan needed, what Lucas liked, what Rebecca expected. Then I wrote the first line, not to be useful, not to be needed, just to be treated like someone whose heart still beats. I stared at the words, letting them breathe. They didn't feel dramatic, man. They felt overdue. I had spent years believing that being indispensable would somehow translate into being loved, that if I stayed helpful I would always be included, that love, if it was big enough, would circle back and wrap me in return, but I had become the crack things fell through, the mix-up, the oversight, missed birthday calls. "Sorry, Mom, we meant to call you earlier, it was just such a busy day." Family emails I was left off of. "I thought I CC'd you. Plans made without checking if I was free. We assumed you wouldn't mind staying with Lucas while we were gone. My presence was not expected. It was assumed. My absence wasn't noticed. It was only measured in what stopped working." The phone buzzed again. "Mom, seriously. This is affecting our credit. What is going on? I didn't need to read it twice." He was frustrated. Not because I had cut him off, but because the machine he'd been plugging into for years had stopped humming. And then, without anger, without spite, I wrote, "There's no confusion. Please direct any future inquiries to your own bank accounts. As of yesterday, mine no longer support you." I hit send. The words didn't feel harsh. They felt clean. Like something finally scrubbed of the film that had covered it for too long. The phone rang within seconds. I let it ring. I imagined him pacing. I knew that rhythm. The hands in his hair, the sighs, the calculations. He would be preparing an explanation, a plea. A new version of this isn't what it looks like. But I was no longer a story to be rewritten. I turned the phone off, placed it upside down on the kitchen table, and sat in the chair I'd had reupholstered last winter. The only thing in the room I'd picked out just for myself. It was time to feed myself something that wasn't disappointment. I stood and made toast. Just toast, no butter, no jam. Just a slice of warmth to put something in my stomach that wasn't emptiness. As I chewed slowly, I listened to the hum of the refrigerator, to the soft tick of the clock above the pantry, to the breeze brushing the side of the house, and nothing else. No expectations, no noise, just my breath, my body, my choice, and I thought, this is what real silence sounds like. Not absence, not punishment. Just the sound of a woman finally deciding to stop whispering her worth. The first thing I did that morning was open the windows. Just a little. Just enough to let the air slip in and touch the curtains. I hadn't done that in months. For years, really. Always adjusting the house to someone else's rhythms. Rebecca had allergies. Lucas needed it quiet to nap. Nathan liked the house cool and dim. Easier to think, he used to say. So I adapted. I cooked what they liked, closed what they disliked, lit candles only when they were out. But today I opened the windows. The breeze carried hints of jasmine and cut grass and something warm I couldn't name. I lit a candle just because I liked the scent. I brewed a stronger tea than usual. I pulled an old record from the shelf, one Tom and I used to dance to in the living room, and let it crackle through the house without apologizing for the noise. I sat in the sunlight on the kitchen floor, sipping from my favorite mug, and felt, for once, like the house belonged to me. It didn't feel empty. It felt mine. The phone rang just before noon. I almost didn't answer. My instinct was to let it pass like all the others. But something in me wanted to hear it. Not because I expected change, but because I knew I could finally listen without folding. "Nathan," I answered. There was a pause, like he hadn't expected me to pick up. "I saw the legal notices," he said. His voice sounded tight, like he was holding too many things at once and none of them fit. "The trust, the deed transfer. I guess you really meant it." I didn't say anything. "So what now?" he asked, quieter. "We just stopped talking. You're done with me." I let the silence stretch, not as a weapon, but as a boundary. Then I said, "I'm not done loving you, Nathan. But I'm done funding the fantasy that love means servitude." He exhaled hard. "Servitude. Are you serious?" "Yes," I said, "dead serious." He laughed. A little bitter, a little wounded. "I can't believe you're doing this after everything I've done for you." That made me pause. I walked to the living room and opened the bottom drawer of the cabinet. Inside was the file Nathan. Support. It was thick, heavy. 25 years of receipts, notes, check stubs, wire confirmations, from soccer cleats to student loans, from late rent to that business venture that lasted 6 months and took 9 years to pay off. Not that he ever did. I held the folder in one hand, the phone in the other. "Nathan," I said calmly, "the only thing you've done for me in the last 10 years is ask for less than usual when you felt guilty." There was silence on the line. He tried again. "You know I appreciate you." "No," I said, cutting gently. "You appreciate what I did for you. Not who I am. Mom, come on. This is all just a misunderstanding." That word again. I almost smiled. Not out of amusement, but because I had finally reached the part of the story where I recognized the script before it finished. "I know you think that," I said, "but it's not confusion. It's choice. You've been choosing for years, and now so am I." He didn't respond right away. I could hear his breath, the shift of his weight, the building of arguments that wouldn't land. He wasn't used to this version of me, the one who didn't jump to patch the silence. Finally, he said, "I don't even know how to talk to you right now." "Then don't," I replied. "Think instead." And I hung up. Not out of anger, not even out of hurt. Just conclusion. Later that evening, I walked downtown. No destination, just movement. I passed the coffee shop where I used to meet Nancy before her hip surgery. I passed the church where Tom and I once renewed our vows. I passed the gas station, not that one, and ended up in front of the library. There was a bench there, not splintered, not sticky with old gum, a proper bench shaded by a maple across from the bakery. It smelled like paper and sugar and late summer. I sat down, smoothed my slacks, and let my back rest against the slats. This time I wasn't waiting for anyone, and the fear I thought would show up, the trembling, the second-guessing, the ache to fix it, didn't come. No guilt, no panic, just quiet. And I thought, maybe this is what freedom feels like. Not applause, not a grand return, just the absence of needing to be invited back, because I wasn't at the bench from the wedding anymore. I wasn't holding a wrapped gift or cookies in a tin. I was holding nothing. And it was enough. It came on a Tuesday. Tucked between the utility bill and a flyer for discounted gutter cleaning, it would have been easy to miss. A plain white envelope, no return address, just my name written in a slanted hand across the front. The second I saw it, I knew. Lucas. My fingers stilled on the stack of mail. I brought it inside, sat at the kitchen table, and held it there for a moment, afraid to open it too quickly, like it might vanish if I rushed. When I finally tore the flap, it came out in one folded sheet of notebook paper. No card, no careful phrasing, just lines of words smudged in places where the pen must have paused. Grandma, are you okay? I don't know what happened between you and Dad, but I miss you. I keep thinking about when we used to make blueberry muffins. You always let me lick the bowl. I hope you're all right. I love you. Lucas. There was no mention of money. No questions about trust funds or deeds or decisions. Just 7 lines from a 13-year-old boy who hadn't learned how to filter his care into politeness or performance. It hit me like sunlight in a dark room, sudden, disarming, and warm enough to crack something open. I set the letter on the table, smoothed the page, and sat beside it like it was a guest I hadn't seen in years. I didn't cry, but my throat tightened with that strange, sharp ache that comes when someone finally speaks to the part of you that thought it had gone invisible. Lucas hadn't chosen sides. He hadn't tried to smooth over the story or fix it. He had just said, "I miss you." And in those words, I wasn't forgotten. I wasn't funding. I wasn't a shadow behind a wedding slideshow. I was someone whose memory still meant comfort. I pulled open the drawer with the note cards I'd saved over the years, the kind I used for thank you notes and condolences. I picked a pale blue one, floral in the corner, and wrote with care my cursive a little less fluid than it used to be, but still mine. Dear Lucas, I'm all right. I've just needed some quiet to think. I miss you too. I remember the muffins. I still have the bowl. And yes, the batter still tastes just as sweet. When you're ready, come visit. We'll bake something new. Love always. Grandma. I placed the letter in an envelope, addressed it in steady print, and walked it out to the post box at the edge of my garden. The lilac bush rustled in the breeze as I raised the red flag. I stood there for a moment, listening to the wind carry scents of old spring and distant rain. I didn't expect a reply. I didn't wait for the mail truck like I used to. But that evening I did something I hadn't done in years. I prepared the guest room, not for Nathan, not for Rebecca, not for some hypothetical holiday gathering, just for Lucas. I changed the sheets. The ones he used to say smelled like summer soap. I fluffed the pillows. I pulled the old fairy tale book from the shelf and placed it on the nightstand. I even tucked the wooden spoon, the one we always used for muffins, into the drawer just in case. And then I baked. Not blueberry this time, raspberry and white chocolate. Something new. I left one on a plate beside his letter on the kitchen table. The doorbell didn't ring that day, or the next. But I didn't check the street. I didn't pace. I didn't hold my breath with every passing car. Because something in me had shifted. I was no longer waiting as proof that I mattered. I was simply ready in case someone wanted to come home. Before bed, I lit a small lamp in the guest room. Not because I thought he'd walk through the door that night, but because sometimes love doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it shows up quiet and late like a soft knock on a tired door. And the least we can do is leave the light on. The knock came just after 2 on a Saturday. It wasn't loud. It wasn't rushed. Just a soft, almost uncertain tap, like a question gently asked without expecting an answer. I had been in the kitchen slicing apples for a tart I wasn't sure I'd finish when I heard it. The knife paused mid-slice. My breath did too. I didn't rush to the door. I wiped my hands on a towel, smoothed the front of my sweater, and walked slowly, steady, toward the sound. When I opened it, he was there. Lucas, backpack slung over one shoulder, jacket zipped up too high for the spring air hair sticking out at odd angles like it had resisted a comb. He looked older, but still awkward in that way boys are when they haven't quite grown into their limbs. Taller than the last time I saw him, more serious in the eyes. He didn't speak right away, just looked at me for a beat too long. And then with a crooked little smile he said, "I came for muffins. Not an apology, not a lead-in, just that I felt my lips lift without permission." "Did you now?" I said and stepped aside. He walked in like he used to when he was 7 and sunburned and barefoot, the way only children who feel at home can walk into a kitchen. Dropped his backpack by the door, paused at the counter where the mixing bowls sat waiting. I hadn't planned to bake that day, but when I read his letter earlier that week, I found myself checking the pantry just in case. "You weren't sure if I'd want to," he said softly, not meeting my eyes. I handed him the wooden spoon, the one with the worn handle and faint burn mark from the time we accidentally left it too close to the stovetop. "You still get to lick the bowl," I said. His grin widened. "Always." We started pulling ingredients without saying much. It wasn't silence exactly, just the kind of quiet that happens when two people remember how to be together. He read the recipe aloud like it was a story, stumbling over confectioner's sugar and teasing me when I forgot to preheat the oven. I let him pick the berries, fresh raspberries I'd bought on impulse the day after his letter came. He liked raspberries best, even though we always used to bake with blueberries. Raspberries feel more like a grown-up choice, he'd once said when he was 10 after discovering them at a brunch buffet. My apron hung off his shoulders like a cape. He refused to tie it, said he liked the way it flowed. He rolled the lemons on the counter with both palms, like I'd taught him years ago, and squeezed them with exaggerated care, fishing out the seeds before I could remind him. We moved like we used to, out of sync, but in rhythm. He cracked the eggs too hard, got shell in the bowl, then picked it out with surgical precision and a smug look of victory. I let it slide. He licked the spatula when he thought I wasn't looking. I pretended not to notice. The oven beeped. As the muffins baked, we cleaned up the counter, rinsed the bowls, and stacked the measuring cups. He dried the last spoon with the corner of a dish towel and asked, "Do you still have the game I knew?" Which one he meant. "The one with the little castles," I said. He nodded. "In the cupboard, top shelf." He pulled it down with a small whoop and set it on the kitchen table. The box was taped at the corners, worn soft from years of use. Inside, the spinner still stuck halfway, and the red knight was missing his sword. We played 2 rounds. He beat me both times fair and square, though I pretended to grumble about dice luck. It wasn't until we were halfway through our second muffin that he spoke again. "Are you mad at Dad?" I looked at him. Really looked at him. His mouth was tight, shoulders a little raised, like he was bracing for something heavier than a conversation. "No," I said gently. "I'm disappointed." "There's a difference." He nodded, eyes still fixed on the crumb between his fingers. "He says you're being unfair," Lucas said. "That you shut him out." I took a long breath, let it settle before I replied. "I did," I said, "but only after years of being asked to stay quiet in my own life." Lucas's fingers stilled. "He gets mad when I ask questions," he said. I reached out and placed my hand over his palm to palm. His were bigger now, but still soft in the middle, like he hadn't grown into the world completely yet. "You don't have to be afraid to ask," I said. "Not here." He didn't answer, but I felt his hand turn slightly beneath mine, just enough that his fingers curled back into mine. A small gesture, but it said everything. We took our muffins out to the garden, sat on the steps beneath the lilac bush that hadn't bloomed fully yet. I watched him study the sky like it was a puzzle he hadn't figured out. "Tell me about Grandpa Tom," he said suddenly. "What was he like before, all the hospital stuff?" I smiled. "He was loud," I said. "He used to whistle while he read, and it drove me nuts. He couldn't boil an egg, but insisted he made the best grilled cheese sandwiches. He once jumped off a barn roof into a haystack to impress a girl. Broke his wrist. Swore me to secrecy." Lucas laughed. "Did it work?" "Apparently not. He didn't marry her. He leaned his head on my shoulder for a moment. Just a second. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loudly. I think I want to visit more, he said quietly. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. I reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind his ear, something I hadn't done since he was small and sticky and afraid of thunder. You always can, I said. We stayed there until the sun dipped behind the trees and the garden fell into that quiet hush it gets before the streetlights come on. He helped me carry the plates back inside, rinsed them without asking, wiped down the table like he'd done it 100 times. When I walked him to the bus stop, he squeezed my hand before climbing the steps. Didn't turn around, just sat down by the window looking forward. And I knew he'd be back. Because some bonds don't break, they just go quiet for a while, until someone is brave enough to knock. Lucas started coming by almost every weekend. No permission slips, no coordinating calls, no carefully worded texts from his father or polite check-ins from Rebecca. Just a soft knock always around the same time on Saturday, and that familiar lopsided grin. He came with a backpack, usually half-zipped, carrying a book or two, sometimes a change of clothes, sometimes nothing at all. He brought stories about a teacher who made math funny, a girl who smelled like bubblegum and talked too loud, a classmate who'd gotten detention for trying to microwave a Pop-Tart without removing the foil. He asked for his favorite foods. The old macaroni recipe I'd nearly forgotten, grilled cheese with too much butter and once chicken nuggets but made fancy. We cooked together. We folded laundry. We planted bulbs in the backyard, tulips, crocuses, daffodils. You know, he said one day, smudged with dirt, these bloom at different times, like staggered happiness. He was becoming someone. Not a copy of Nathan. Not a mirror of Rebecca. Just Lucas. His own rhythm. His own edges. One Saturday morning, after we'd spent an hour reorganizing the pantry, just because he thought it was chaotic, I heard the doorbell ring again. I assumed he'd forgotten something on the porch. Maybe a book, maybe his headphones. But when I opened the door, it wasn't Lucas. It was Nathan. He stood there, jacket too thin for the weather, holding a brown grocery bag like it might explain his presence. In it I could see a box of chamomile tea, 2 scones from the bakery I loved, and a folded magazine with a sticky note on the cover. Thought you'd like the gardening tips. Hi, Mom, he said, voice careful, measured. I didn't step back. I didn't step forward either. Why are you here, I asked. He looked down then, past me into the house. I wanted to see it again. You lived here, I said. You know what it looks like. He flinched. Barely. Then took a slow breath. I didn't mean the walls. I let him in. He sat at the kitchen table. I didn't offer him tea. His eyes moved around the room like a stranger's would. He paused on the wooden spoon in the drying rack, on the photo of Lucas and me in the garden, on the cross-stitch on the wall that read, "Home is where your voice matters." Lucas had made it during one of his visits. He hadn't said a word while stitching it, just pushed the needle through the fabric with quiet, steady hands. Nathan shifted in his seat. Lucas talks about you all the time, he said. I didn't expect that. I nodded, arms crossed lightly. Because you didn't think I had anything left to offer. That's not true. It's how you lived. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaled slowly. He seems different, more sure of himself, opinionated. I smiled, just slightly. He's learning to ask questions. Nathan looked up, brow furrowed. And you think that's because of you? I think that's because I don't punish curiosity. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Tried again. I didn't know how to fix it, he said quietly. No, I replied. You left it for me to hold. Like everything else. There was a long pause, the kind that makes clocks louder and sunlight sharper. Then, barely audible, he said, I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic. No tears, no trembling lips. Just a whisper from someone who finally ran out of ways to justify not saying it. I nodded, let the words settle. I didn't rush to fill the silence. You're not too late, I said. His eyes met mine, uncertain. But if you want to know me now, I added, you'll have to start from the beginning. He hesitated. With Lucas. No, I said. With me. The papers were already waiting for me when I stepped into Mr. Ellison's office. Everything was in place. The trust for Lucas, the revised will, the deed to the house now in my name alone with no co-signers, no hidden beneficiaries, just mine. He greeted me with that quiet familiarity I'd come to appreciate, respectful without pity. It's all here, he said, tapping the folder with 2 fingers. Sign where marked. I picked up the pen. No trembling, no second guessing. Just ink. Lines drawn where none had existed before. He watched me sign page by page, then finally said, "You're not the first parent I've helped do this, but I wish more did it before they were broken." I looked up. "I'm not broken," I said. "Just done being foolish." He smiled. Not wide, but real. That might be rarer. Back home, I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened every window in the house. Let the air in. Let the jasmine drift through the curtains and the sound of birds settle into the corners. The house didn't echo anymore. It didn't feel like it was waiting for someone. It just felt full of breath, of self. Later that evening, the phone rang. I didn't flinch when I saw Nathan's name. I didn't brace myself. I simply answered. "Hi," he said. "I saw the legal notices, the deed, the trust. I figured you would." I said, "So, you really meant it?" "I did." There was a pause. "I guess I thought—" He trailed off, then gathered the nerve. "What now?" "Are we just done?" I let the question hang in the space between us. "I'm not done loving you, Nathan," I said. "But I'm done funding the fantasy that love means servitude." His breath caught. There was a part of me, the mother part, that wanted to soften it, wanted to wrap it in sugar. But truth doesn't need decoration. It just needs air. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "Then say nothing." I replied, "Think instead." And I hung up. Not out of anger, just clarity. Lucas came the next weekend, and the one after that. He brought a new board game, said he wanted to teach me how to play. I pretended I didn't understand the rules just to make him explain them twice. He rolled his eyes and laughed. He baked cookies without supervision, burned the first batch, and proudly declared them edible if you're brave. We didn't talk about Nathan, not because it was forbidden, but because peace doesn't require a script. It just lives where it's welcome. The house began to feel like mine again, not a relic of someone else's plans, not a museum of other people's comfort, mine. I started little routines I'd long abandoned, reading after dinner, planting bulbs along the front walk, things that would bloom in stages with no demand for applause. I made Tom's favorite stew one rainy afternoon and ate it slowly with toast and a book propped open beside my plate. Lucas found a box of my old recipe cards. One visit asked if he could take pictures for a school project. "Only if you promise not to correct my handwriting," I joked. He smiled. "It's part of the charm." We didn't mention Rachel. Her name sat like a closed book on a shelf. Not thrown out, not ripped up, just no longer opened. Some chapters don't need rereading. One evening as the light faded and the windows glowed with kitchen warmth, I stood in the hallway in front of the mirror. I paused. Not because I needed reassurance, but because for the first time in years I saw a woman I recognized. She wasn't angry. She wasn't waiting. She wasn't shrinking to make space for someone else's needs. She was quiet. But not because someone told her to be. She was quiet because peace doesn't shout. And maybe that's the story I was always meant to tell. Not about the day I was left behind, but the life I found after. Have you ever felt like a guest in your own family, like love meant giving everything, and still not being seen? If this story touched something in you, if you've ever waited by a phone or a door or a bench hoping someone would remember you, then know this: you are not alone. Your voice still matters, and your story is not over. We tell these stories not just to remember, but to heal. If you'd like to hear more journeys of quiet strength and silent dignity, subscribe to Revenge Mom Diaries. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones no one saw coming.